Welcome to Sustainability Soundbites, presented by E&E Leader. Hidden single-source risk behind generic drug supply. A hospital may buy the same generic drug from multiple suppliers and still depend on a common manufacturer thousands of miles upstream. That distinction is becoming more important as the U.S. prepares for a major change in pharmaceutical trade policy. Healthcare procurement teams have spent years building redundancy into pharmaceutical purchasing. A critical generic may have multiple approved manufacturers, multiple distributors, and several products available for substitution. And on paper, that looks diversified. Upstream, it can be something very different. And the deeper problem is that the usual numbers can still understate just how concentrated that dependency really is. Brookings' testimony delivered to Congress in March 2026 found that India supplied 61% of the roughly 187 billion generic tablets and capsules dispensed through U.S. retail and mail pharmacies in 2024. The FDA offered another measure of concentration when it announced a domestic review pilot program in October 2025. Just 9% of active pharmaceutical ingredient manufacturers were located in the United States, compared with 44% in India and 22% in China. An Indian finished dose manufacturer, though, may rely on an API or key starting material from China, and several competing finished products can ultimately trace back to the same upstream source. For healthcare procurement, supplier count and supply chain redundancy are not necessarily the same thing. Multiple vendors can lead back to one source. The concentration becomes clearer when individual drugs are examined rather than the pharmaceutical market as a whole. Analysis presented to the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission has put roughly a quarter of the API volume in U.S. generic drugs as potentially sourced from China, arriving either directly or indirectly through India, with the Commission separately warning that supply chain visibility remains poor enough to make the exact proportion difficult to pin down. The Council on Foreign Relations documented an even deeper upstream concentration in its June 2026 report. Nearly 41% of key starting materials used in U.S.-approved APIs come solely from China, and another 16% from India. Amoxicillin illustrates the problem well. India dominates finished amoxicillin manufacturing at 59% of supply, but CFR's analysis found China supplies 94% of the world's starting materials used to produce it, and 5 Chinese companies, including the state-owned North China Pharmaceutical Corporation, control more than 4/5 of global production of 6-APA, the principal intermediate used to manufacture the drug. A hospital sourcing amoxicillin from multiple finished product manufacturers can therefore appear diversified while remaining exposed to the same chemical choke point. Generic drug economics make redundancy harder. That concentration exists alongside another vulnerability, the economics of generic manufacturing itself. FDA has long identified a lack of incentives to manufacture less profitable drugs as a root cause of shortages, and HHS reached a similar conclusion in a December 2024 analysis, finding that generic prices can be pushed low enough to discourage investment in redundant capacity and more resilient manufacturing. The problem is particularly visible among generic injectables, where an HHS analysis found that 70% of recently launched generic injectable drugs studied had failed to reach profitability by their 3rd year on the market, a pattern the agency said may contribute to thinner markets that are less resilient to shortages. That matters because a manufacturer facing a significant new cost does not have unlimited ability to absorb it, and buyers cannot assume higher costs will simply produce proportionally higher drug prices. A manufacturer can instead reduce investment, discontinue an unprofitable product, or shift finite production capacity toward products offering better returns, and FDA notes that markets with only a small number of manufacturers can become especially vulnerable when one producer exits or encounters a manufacturing problem. For hospitals, the result can arrive as an availability problem rather than a conventional price increase, a dynamic that only becomes visible once a company actually maps its supply chain past the first tier of named suppliers. Tariffs. Put a date on the procurement question. That existing weakness now has a deadline attached to it. President Trump announced in July that imported generic drugs will remain at a zero tariff for 2 years beginning August 1st, 2026, with the rate then scheduled to rise to 100% in August 2028 and 200% 1 year later, a schedule that echoes the phased pass-through clauses already reshaping how buyers in other sectors model tariff exposure years before it actually hits. The 2-year exemption reduces the immediate cost shock, but it does not eliminate the strategic question. Moving pharmaceutical manufacturing is not equivalent to finding another commodity supplier. Production facilities require capital, regulatory approval, validated manufacturing processes, and reliable sources of APIs and chemical intermediates, and replacing an Indian finished dose manufacturer with domestic production does little to eliminate the risk if the domestic plant remains dependent on the same Chinese upstream inputs. For healthcare procurement leaders, that makes the next 2 years matter considerably more than the current zero tariff rate suggests. Procurement needs to map beyond the label. The traditional supplier risk exercise starts with the manufacturer or distributor named in the contract, and for critical generics that may no longer go far enough. Healthcare organizations increasingly need to know where the finished dosage form is manufactured, where its API originates, whether key starting materials have alternative sources, and whether supposedly competing products share the same upstream dependencies, a level of documented diligence that buyers in other regulated categories are already being expected to hold. That information is not always easy to obtain, and supply chain visibility remains one of the weaknesses identified repeatedly by federal agencies and pharmaceutical researchers. But the absence of visibility does not eliminate the concentration. It only makes it harder to see. The procurement question heading toward 2028 is therefore not simply whether a health system has 2 or 3 suppliers for a critical generic. It is whether those suppliers actually represent 2 or 3 independent supply chains, or whether a drug cabinet stocked with products carrying different labels, purchased under different contracts, and delivered by different distributors, all begins with the same upstream source. If it does, the redundancy may exist only on paper. Interested in a soundbite sponsorship? Check out the energy category, currently sponsored by Amazon. Reach out to our team for more information. Thank you for listening.